April 26, 1945. The outskirts of Nuremberg, Germany. The sky hung low and gray, the air thick with the smell of diesel and damp soil. Pockets of smoke drifted lazily from the shattered tree line, where the wreckage of tanks, American and German alike, lay gutted and silent. The battle for the city had raged for days, and what remained of the U.S. 14th Armored Division was spread thin across the rolling farmland west of town. Private First Class Clarence Smoyer, just 21 years old, a Pennsylvania farm boy with mud still in his bones, crouched behind the smoking carcass of his Sherman tank. Lucky lady. Its turret had been blown apart by a German 75mm shell an hour earlier. The impact had killed his gunner instantly and left the crew scattered, dazed and bleeding in the ditches. Clarence pressed his back against the scorched metal, his M1 carbine clutched tight. The heat of the wreck still radiated against his spine, and every breath tasted of soot and cordite. In the distance he could hear it, the rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel, the clipped commands shouted in German. They were coming. Through the drifting smoke he counted shapes, helmeted silhouettes moving in disciplined lines. A full German counterattack force, maybe 200 men strong, fanning out toward the American line. The rest of Clarence's platoon had fallen back half a mile to regroup. If these Germans made it through, they'd hit the American flank wide open. He wiped the grime from his eyes and thought about the farm back home, the smell of hay after rain, the hum of crickets in the summer fields. He hadn't joined the army to be a hero. He'd joined to escape the dust and the endless chores. But now, crouched behind a dead tank in a foreign land, he realized there was no one left between those Germans and his friends. He looked at Lucky Lady, her armor still glowing faintly red around the breach. The fuel tank was leaking, dripping steadily into a blackened puddle beneath her. She was done, dead weight. But to Clarence, she was still something. Still a shape, still a wall, still a weapon. And then, through the haze and fear, an idea sparked. Crazy, desperate, but maybe enough. He crawled to the front of the tank, careful not to silhouette himself against the horizon. The enemy was maybe 400 yards out now, moving between hedgerows, rifles glinting in the dim light. The fields were open. They had no cover, but neither did he. That was when the thought hit him full. What if he could make them think this tank was still alive? The fire from the engine compartment was smoldering, giving off thick, oily smoke. He grabbed a rag from the ground, a torn piece of his crew's blanket, and wrapped it around a metal rod. He dipped it in the leaking gasoline and touched it to the glowing steel. The rag burst into flames instantly. Clarence grinned despite himself. "You'll do," he muttered. He scrambled up onto the rear deck, balancing on the slippery armor. From the hatch he could still see the 76mm gun, locked in place pointing toward the east. He jammed his burning rag under the barrel, making it look as if the tank's gun was about to fire. Then, crouching low, he grabbed the .50 caliber machine gun that was half melted on the cupola. It still had half a belt of ammunition hanging loose. He yanked the charging handle and prayed. The bolt slammed forward with a metallic click. Then the first German burst into view. Gray uniform, submachine gun raised, shouting orders. Clarence squeezed the trigger. The .50 roared to life, tracers ripping across the field like fiery spears. The German line froze, then scattered, diving for cover that didn't exist. Clarence kept firing, sweeping the gun left and right, his face lit by the flashes. To the Germans it looked like a burning tank had come back from the dead, its gun still spitting fire and defiance. They couldn't see the lone soldier behind it. They could only see the beast, blazing and alive, guarding the road to Nuremberg. Clarence knew he couldn't hold them forever. But every second they stayed pinned meant his unit had time to regroup, to dig in, to survive. Smoke filled his lungs, his ears rang from the gunfire, and his fingers bled from the recoil. But still he fired. One farm boy, one broken tank, and 250 Germans who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The bolt of the .50 cal was scorching hot now, and every burst of fire rattled Clarence's bones. Spent casings bounced off the turret and rolled down onto the deck, clinking like wind chimes against steel. The Germans had dropped flat into the plowed field, vanishing into the furrows like quail startled by gunfire. Clarence caught movement to his left. An NCO stood, waving his men forward and pointing directly at the Sherman. He shouted something Clarence couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears, but he didn't have to. He saw the intent. A group of German infantry, maybe a dozen, began sprinting toward the tank using bounding movement, leapfrogging in pairs. These weren't raw recruits. These were veterans, disciplined, aggressive, and confident. Clarence inhaled sharply, bracing behind the 50. "Come on," he whispered. "Closer." He fired a short burst. 2 men dropped. The rest dove into a drainage ditch 30 yards from the tank. Clarence ducked down, hugging the cupola as a storm of return fire cracked past him. Bullets pinged against the armor, sending sparks in every direction. One round shattered the periscope just inches from his head, spraying him with glass particles. He tasted blood. He didn't know whether it was from a cut or where he'd bitten his tongue. Inside his head, panic clawed for space. This was stupid, insane. I should have run when I had the chance, but below the fear was something deeper: stubbornness. The same kind that had kept him plowing fields in knee-deep mud with a mule that refused to turn. Back home, his father always said farm boys weren't brave. They were too tired to be afraid. Clarence swallowed hard. "Guess you were wrong about that, Pa." He fired again. The German squad in the ditch tried to flank him, crawling along the ditch line, thinking they were invisible. Clarence angled the 50 down, sweeping fire over the ditch's lip. Tracers sparked against the muddy earth. 2 helmets popped up, then disappeared. Someone screamed in German. The rest broke and ran. Clarence didn't cheer. He didn't have breath for it. He just fed another belt into the gun, fingers trembling. He paused long enough to scan the field. Tracer smoke curled from the barrel in long, ghostly ribbons. The German advance that had been so confident minutes ago now hesitated, like a predator unsure if the wounded animal in front of them had one last bite left. Then came the sound he dreaded. Metal on. Metal. Armor. Clarence pressed his cheek to the cooling armor and peered through the haze. A German half-track rolled into view, its engine growling low like an angry dog. 8 infantrymen rode in the back, MG-34 mounted on the front shield. They were heading straight for him. The 50 caliber felt suddenly small. Clarence waited until they were close. 60 yards. 50, 40. The half-track accelerated. Now, he unleashed a full belt. Rounds tore through the windshield and ripped into the crew compartment. The MG-34 gunner convulsed backward as a tracer hit him square in the chest. Sparks erupted along the engine block until, whump! The half-track erupted into flames, grinding to a halt. The soldiers in the back leaped off, clothes on fire, diving into the dirt to smother the flames. Clarence kept firing until the last of them scattered. He couldn't hear anything except the ringing in his ears and the thump of his own heartbeat. Smoke, diesel, and burning rubber wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket. His vision blurred. He clenched the 50's grips to steady himself. Don't pass out. Not now. Not yet. Clarence ducked down behind the turret, gulping air. The fire beneath him was growing hotter, the leaking fuel now burning steadily, licking up the sides of the tank like orange fingers. If the flames reached the main gun's shell storage, what remained of it? The whole Sherman could blow. He weighed his choices. Stay and hold them off, or jump and run, leaving nothing between the Germans and the American flank. Boot steps crunched on gravel. He froze. Voices. German. Close, too close. Clarence pressed himself flat, listening. 3 soldiers crept around the rear of Lucky Lady, speaking in hushed tones. One tapped the armor with the butt of his rifle. They thought the tank crew was still inside. Clarence's pulse hammered. His hands shook. He slid his carbine from its sling quietly. Slow, careful movements. He could hear his old drill sergeant in his head. Slow as smooth. Smooth as fast. One of the Germans climbed onto the deck. Clarence heard the crunch of his boots near the burning rag. Another stepped up behind him, rifle ready. Clarence didn't think. He moved. He swung the butt of the carbine hard, cracking it against the first soldier's helmet. The man dropped instantly. The second soldier went to shout, but Clarence fired 2 quick shots point blank. The third turned to run, shouting for help. Clarence dropped him with a controlled 3-round burst. His whole body trembled. Not from fear now, but from adrenaline. He scrambled back to the 50 just as another wave of Germans started moving across the field, this time from the north. More disciplined. More determined, the tank fire popped louder. The temperature on the deck rose sharply. Clarence gritted his teeth, locked his jaw, and racked the bolt one more time. He wasn't done. Not yet. Clarence slapped the charging handle forward. The bolt slid home with a harsh metallic snap. Smoke curled around him in thick waves, burning his lungs with each inhale. The fire beneath the Sherman was no longer a smolder. It was alive, hungry, stretching upward like it wanted to swallow him whole. Heat shimmered around the turret, blurring the far edge of the field into ghostly shapes. Then the horizon sharpened. The Germans were coming again, not in scattered groups this time, but in formation, stretched across the farmland in a long skirmish line, bayonets glinting. Maybe a company's worth, 80, 90 men. Their discipline showed even here. These weren't stragglers or last-ditch volunteers. These soldiers moved with the confidence of men who expected to win. Clarence wiped the sweat from his brow with a shaking arm. His hair, matted with soot, stuck to his skin. He could feel the heat of the fire through his boots. Time was running out. Maybe minutes. He leaned into the 50 and pressed the butterfly triggers. The big gun snarled. The field ripped open with dust kicks and splintering earth. Men scattered, dove, fired back. Bullets hammered the tank with a constant ping-ping-ping, ricocheting like hail in a metal storm. Clarence kept firing, short, disciplined bursts. His world shrank to the iron sights, the bobbing helmets, the rhythmic recoil against his chest. The 50 overheated. Smoke poured from the receiver. He eased off, slapped a fresh belt into place. His fingers were slick with sweat and grease. He pressed the trigger. Click. The belt jammed. Clarence swore under his breath and worked the feed tray open, clearing the belt with shaking hands. He'd done this 100 times in training, but never with flames licking at his legs and bullets snapping at his ears. The next belt fed. He slammed it shut. The gun barked again. A German officer in a peaked cap pointed directly at him, whistle in his mouth. 2 MG-42 crews sprinted forward, dragging their equipment like sled runners. Clarence knew what that meant. Suppress the tank, then flank. He swung the 50 toward them. A burst from the MG-42 sliced across the deck, cutting sparks off the turret ring. Clarence dropped instinctively, feeling the rounds pass through the air where his head had been a second earlier. He popped up and fired. The tracers chewed into the MG crew. The assistant gunner folded. The remaining crewman grabbed the MG-42, dragging it behind a shattered plow. Clarence swept the gun left, and the second MG-42 opened up from the opposite side, nearly invisible behind a hay bale. Clarence jerked backward as bullets tore past. One round punched clean through his sleeve, grazing the skin. He didn't notice the blood. He only noticed the belt count, half gone. He stood again, spun the 50, and fired a long burst. Bullets shredded the hay bale into a golden explosion. The second crew slumped, motionless. Clarence exhaled hard and coughed, lungs seizing from the smoke. He wasn't winning. He was delaying, and the Germans were realizing it. A whistle blast cut through the gunfire, sharp, decisive. Clarence saw movement, fast. A squad broke from the main line and rushed toward him, low and fast, using the bodies of their fallen for cover. Grenades hung from their belts. One man carried a bundle charge. Engineer satchel. Canvas wrapped around high explosive. Tank-killing charge. Clarence squeezed the trigger again. His burst tore into the front ranks, bodies dropping mid-sprint. But 2 reached the low wall just 20 yards away, close enough to throw. Clarence ducked as a grenade clattered on the deck near the turret. He kicked it. Hard. It bounced off the turret edge and dropped off the other side of the tank. Boom. The explosion shook the world. Clarence's ears rang, and for a moment everything was muffled, like he'd been plunged underwater. His teeth vibrated from the concussive shock. He struggled back to his feet. The 2 remaining Germans were climbing onto the tank, faces smeared with mud and adrenaline. One held a knife. The other raised the satchel charge. Clarence didn't think. He body-slammed the man with the satchel off the side of the tank. They hit the ground together, rolling in the gravel. The German tried to scramble for his weapon, but Clarence's fist connected with his jaw, once, twice, 3 times until the soldier went limp. He turned, sucking air, searching for the second attacker. Boots scraped behind him. The knife flashed. Clarence caught the attacker's wrist just as the blade swept toward his ribs. They locked in a desperate grapple on the burning deck. The heat was unbearable. His uniform was starting to smoke. The German drove forward, his face twisted in rage. Clarence smelled sweat, metal, and burning fabric. He forced the soldier's wrist backward, slow, inch by inch, until the knife angled away. Then Clarence slammed his elbow into the man's nose. The soldier crumpled, dropping the knife. Clarence kicked him off the tank. His vision swam. The heat had become unbearable. The fuel fire below finally reached the ammunition racks. The first pop sounded like a firecracker. Then another. If those propellant charges went off, the Sherman would become a bomb. Clarence grabbed the .50 again, firing blind bursts across the field. His voice cracked as he shouted, half rage, half exhaustion. Come on. But somewhere deep down, he knew. Time was up. Then, through the smoke and chaos, Clarence heard a sound he hadn't heard all day. American voices, shouting, yelling orders. Behind him, over the ridge, GIs appeared, sprinting forward, rifles raised. Jeeps with 30 cal machine guns roared into position, spraying fire across the German line. Reinforcements. Clarence sagged against the turret, every muscle drained. The Germans hesitated just for a moment, then broke. Soldiers dropped weapons, sprinting back toward the tree line. He had done it, one farm boy, one dead tank, against impossible odds, and he'd held them for an hour. The fire surged again beneath him. Clarence looked down at the burning deck. He had one last decision to make. The Sherman beneath him groaned, metal expanding, ammunition cooking off inside the hull. Each pop was louder than the last. There wasn't much time. Clarence wiped soot and sweat from his eyes, forcing himself to focus. Reinforcements or not, if he stayed on this tank much longer, there'd be nothing left of him to find. He slid off the turret and landed hard on the grit below, stumbling as his boots hit the earth. His legs nearly buckled. Every muscle protested after the hour-long siege, adrenaline draining from his body like water from a cracked canteen. He staggered into a crouch, clutching his carbine. Smoke rolled across the ground in serpentine wisps. Behind him, the .50 cal still smoldered on the turret ring. Clarence hesitated just long enough to drag the remaining ammunition belt behind cover. Instinct, nothing wasted. Even now, the fire beneath the Sherman roared, flames licking up through the engine compartment. The air around the tank shimmered with heat. Get away. You did your part. Clarence backed off step by shaky step, then he heard it. Halt. The voice came from behind him. Accented English, sharp and desperate. Clarence spun, carbine raised. 10 yards away stood a German soldier, dusty uniform smeared with ash and blood, his hands trembling around a captured American Thompson. The German swallowed, eyes wide. He was no older than Clarence, maybe 19. I said halt, he repeated, voice cracking. Clarence didn't fire. Neither did the German. They just stared at each other. Two exhausted boys in uniforms they never asked for, breathing smoke and fear. Clarence lowered his carbine slightly. Not surrender, just acknowledgement. Don't do this, he said quietly. For a heartbeat, the German hesitated. Then, reflex or fear, the soldier jerked the trigger. Clarence dove sideways, bullets stitching the ground where he'd stood. He rolled, came up on one knee, and squeezed his trigger. A single shot, clean. Final. The German dropped. His helmet rolled 2 feet, settling in the mud. Clarence exhaled shakily. He didn't have the luxury of reflection. He didn't have time to feel anything. The Sherman's internal ammo finally ignited K-Thum. The explosion lifted the turret clear off the hull. Clarence shielded his face as a wave of heat slammed into him. The turret arced through the air like a coin tossed by a giant, hitting the ground 20 yards away with a crater-making thud. Flames shot into the sky. The tank that had shielded him, protected him, fought for him, died in a final burst of fire and shrapnel. Clarence stood frozen. He felt the concussion in his bones. Behind the burning hulk, American reinforcements poured across the field. Rifle squads advanced in leaps, firing from the hip. A jeep screeched to a halt nearby, the 30 cal on the Pintle mount chattering non-stop. A sergeant leapt out and scanned the chaos. "Medic, get a medic over here." Clarence shook his head. "I'm fine." The sergeant looked him up and down, uniform scorched, sleeves burned open, face smeared with black like a coal miner. "Fine?" the sergeant snorted. "Son, you look like you wrestled the devil." Clarence didn't laugh. He just nodded once and leaned against a fence post, body trembling. His muscles burned, his lungs raw from smoke inhalation. A medic jogged up, dropping to a knee beside him. "You hit anywhere?" "No," Clarence rasped. "Just tired." The medic glanced at the burning tank. "That your Sherman?" Clarence nodded. "You bail out before it cooked off?" Clarence shook his head. "Stayed on it," the medic paused. "How long?" Clarence looked out across the fields, now littered with bodies and abandoned equipment. German helmets lay scattered like gray stones. The fire from the tank cast dancing orange light across the farmland, he answered softly. "An hour." The medic froze. "No one stays on a burning Sherman for an hour." Clarence didn't respond. His eyes followed a cluster of American infantry sprinting past, pushing toward the retreating Germans. The battle was still going, but the momentum had shifted. The German counterattack, 100 strong, had been stopped cold on this field. Behind him, more Americans arrived. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks loaded with infantry. The sight should have filled him with pride, relief. Instead, all he felt was a hollow quiet. His crew wasn't there to see it. He swallowed hard, eyes burning. Lucky Lady had carried them across France, across Belgium, through ruined cities and open fields. She had been their shield, their home, their luck. Now she was a twisted skeleton of steel. Clarence pushed himself upright. The medic reached out as if to steady him, but Clarence waved him off. "I gotta get back to my unit." The sergeant who'd spoken earlier stepped in front of him. "They'll want to hear what happened out here." "No," Clarence murmured. "They don't need to hear it." He didn't say the truth, that telling the story meant reliving it. The sergeant pointed toward the road where reinforcements continued rolling in. "Go, we'll take it from here." Clarence nodded once, started walking. Each step felt heavier than the last. His boots crunched on broken glass and spent casings. The trampled earth soft beneath him. Behind him, the burning tank spat another jet of flame. Ahead of him waited the uncertain road to Nuremberg, and whatever came after, he walked on. Clarence limped along the dirt road away from the inferno that used to be Lucky Lady. The horizon glowed orange behind him, the burning tank throwing shadows that stretched across the broken field like long black fingers. Each breath still tasted of soot and cordite. Each step reminded him of bruises he didn't yet feel. He passed scattered equipment, an abandoned German helmet, a shattered entrenching tool, a canteen with bullet holes punched clean through it. The small, mundane objects felt unreal, like remnants of someone else's nightmare. In the distance, the low rumble of American armor grew louder. Fresh Shermans topped the crest of the hill, rolling forward with the calm inevitability of a tide returning to shore. Infantry jogged alongside them, helmets bobbing, weapons ready. Clarence recognized one of the tank commanders standing upright in the hatch, Lieutenant Harris from Bravo Company. Harris leaned out as his tank slowed. "Smoyer, Christ, we thought you were dead." Clarence managed a thin smile. "Not today." Harris stared past him at the burning wreck. "Was that your tank?" Clarence nodded. No wonder Battalion HQ was freaking out. They were hearing 250 Krauts were held up by a burning Sherman. Didn't think it was one guy behind the gun. Clarence said nothing. The lieutenant studied him, expression shifting from shock to disbelief, and finally, "Respect, you come with us." "Battalion wants a report." Clarence stiffened. "I need to get back to Able Company first." We got separated when Harris reached down and gripped Clarence's forearm. "Not demanding, just steady, you'll see them soon. But right now, you're going to ride. You look like you'll fall over if the wind hits you right." Clarence hesitated. His instincts screamed to keep moving, to find his crew, those still alive. But his legs wobbled beneath him and dizziness washed over his vision. "Fine," Clarence breathed. "Just don't make a big deal about it." Harris gave a humorless laugh. Too late for that. He hauled Clarence up onto the tank. The metal was warm from the engine but comforting compared to the blistering heat he'd just escaped. Clarence slumped against the turret, head tilted back, letting the vibration of the engine settle into his bones. The tank lurched forward, rolling toward the American positions. For the first time in hours, Clarence allowed his eyes to unfocus. The adrenaline that had carried him evaporated, leaving exhaustion in its wake, heavy, consuming. Below them, the battlefield stretched out like a hellscape. Dark soil churned from artillery blasts, bodies lying motionless in the furrows where men had crawled and fought. Smoke drifted in lazy spirals into the open sky. The fields that once fed livestock were now a graveyard. Harris glanced down at him. "What were you thinking, staying on a burning tank?" Clarence answered softly. "I wasn't thinking." He swallowed hard. "I was trying to keep them alive." A jeep met them halfway to the rear command post. The division executive officer himself stepped out. Major Harlan, stiff uniform, immaculate even here. Harris jumped down and saluted. Clarence followed more slowly. Harlan approached, boots sinking into the mud. "Which one of you held off that counterattack?" Clarence shifted uneasily. "Sir, Harlan cut him off." "I said who?" Clarence met his eyes. "Private First Class Clarence Smoyer, sir." The major looked him over. Burned sleeves, grime-caked face, eyes hollow from the shock of surviving when he shouldn't have. Harlan took a slow breath. "Son, the Germans radioed reports of your tank firing for nearly an hour. Intelligence says they thought they'd stumbled into an ambush by an entire company." Clarence stiffened. "One man isn't an ambush." Harlan stepped closer. "Today it was." He reached into his map case and pulled something out. A silver star still in its case. Clarence blinked. "Sir, I didn't—" "This is not a ceremony," Harlan interrupted. "There's no band, no speech, no photographers. Just a soldier who bought the 15th Army an hour when they needed it." He pressed the metal case into Clarence's hand. "You can accept it now, or I can pin it on you in front of the entire division. Your choice." Clarence stared at the metal, feeling its weight, its cold metal edges biting into his palm. He shook his head slowly. "Not now, sir." Harlan nodded once, satisfied. "Then at least sit down. You look like hell." Clarence lowered himself onto a supply crate. The wood creaked beneath his weight. Nearby, medics tended to wounded soldiers, their murmured voices blending with the distant thud of artillery. A shadow fell across him. It was Sergeant Miller, dirty, exhausted, but alive. Clarence hadn't even seen him approach. Miller crouched down and stared at him for a long moment. "So," Miller finally said, voice dry, "we leave you alone for 1 hour, and you fight off a battalion with a dead tank?" Clarence managed a weak laugh, the first since dawn. Lucky lady wasn't dead yet. Miller sat beside him. "She is now." They both turned to look at the faint glow on the horizon. After a long silence, Miller put a hand on Clarence's shoulder. "You did right." Clarence closed his eyes. The words hit harder than the explosion. The farm boy from Pennsylvania who never sought glory, who hated attention, had stood alone on a burning tank and stopped 250 Germans. Not because he wanted to be a hero, because someone needed to. Clarence whispered, barely audible, "I just didn't want them to get through." And for the first time since the firefight began, he allowed himself to feel the shaking in his hands. The sun dipped low, painting the Nuremberg skyline in shades of copper and ash. The battlefields were quiet now, except for distant artillery and the low hum of American vehicles moving into captured positions. Clarence stood at the edge of the shattered farmland, watching smoke curl upward from the ruins of Lucky Lady. Flames had died to embers, but the memory of heat still lingered on his skin. Nearby, soldiers sifted through the wreckage, pulling bodies, gathering gear, taking stock. For the men around him, the story of what had happened here was already growing into legend. Some whispered about a ghost Sherman that had single-handedly held a German company at bay. Others shook their heads, muttering disbelief. Clarence didn't correct them. He simply walked among them, quietly, shoulders still hunched from exhaustion. Later, at battalion headquarters, Major Harlan called him into a sparse tent, maps pinned across the walls. Clarence stepped in, boots crunching on canvas floor. The officers inside were scribbling reports, making phone calls, preparing debriefs. He felt out of place. "Sit, Smoyer," Harlan said, pointing to a folding chair. Clarence lowered himself cautiously. "Private," Harlan began, voice deliberate, "you did something today that doesn't happen in training manuals. You held a counterattack with nothing but a burning Sherman, a 50 cal, and your wits. The battalion owes its flank to you. The 15th Army owes its advance to you." Clarence looked down at his hands. He could still feel the burns, the cuts, the lingering ache in his back. "I just did what I had to," he muttered. Harlan leaned forward, placing a hand on the metal case again. Sometimes just doing what you have to is enough to turn the tide of a battle. Today, it was more than enough. Reports and photographs would eventually circulate. Military historians would later record how a single Sherman, seemingly abandoned and ablaze, stopped 250 German troops for a full hour, allowing American forces to regroup and advance into Nuremberg. Clarence's name would appear in dispatches tucked among awards and mentions almost too modest to recognize. But for Clarence, the memory wasn't in the medals. It was in the faces of men who had survived because he had chosen to stay. It was in the smell of smoke and diesel that would haunt him for years. The recoil of the 50 cal, the fleeting glimpse of German soldiers frozen in disbelief. It was in the realization that one person, even a farm boy from Pennsylvania, could make a difference when it counted the most. Decades later, Clarence would sit in a small living room, telling the story to grandchildren who could barely picture a world at war. He would leave out the fear, the chaos, and the moments he had come close to death. He would focus instead on the tank, the field, and the idea that seemed too crazy to work, but did. He'd show them a photograph of Lucky Lady, burnt and twisted, a monument of steel against the open fields, and he'd tell them, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand in the right place at the right time. That's all. The story of Clarence Smoyer, the farm boy who made a burning tank a fortress, who held back an entire German advance for a crucial hour, remained a lesson in courage, ingenuity, and the quiet, unassuming bravery of those who never sought the spotlight. Lucky Lady would burn, but its legend and Clarence's daring would never fade. The fields healed, the city rebuilt, and the war moved on. But for the men who survived that hour, the memory of one tank, one soldier, and a fire that refused to die would live forever.